Brother, sister, a military funeral carries a specific kind of weight that most ordinary funerals simply don't. The folded flag, the 21-gun salute, the sound of taps carrying across the cemetery, each one a formal, deliberate act of a grateful nation, honoring someone who gave their life, or years of it, in actual service to their country. And yet believers, often with genuinely good intentions, sometimes handle these moments poorly. Not out of disrespect exactly, but out of simply not understanding what these specific rituals actually mean, or letting their own instincts and habits from ordinary social settings override the solemnity the moment actually calls for, without ever pausing to consider that a different kind of attention is being asked of them entirely. Today we're naming 6 things Christians commonly do wrong at a military funeral service. Mistakes that usually come from good intentions poorly applied, rather than genuine disrespect, since most of us simply weren't raised with any formal exposure to these specific traditions or their meaning. This isn't about shaming anyone who's made one of these honest mistakes before, since nearly everyone has made at least one of them without ever fully realizing it at the time. It's about honoring both the fallen and their families the way military tradition, and frankly basic reverence, actually calls for. Stay with me. If you've ever attended one of these services, you may recognize a few of these. Think about the last military funeral or memorial service you personally attended, if you have. Think carefully about what you actually did during the honor guard ceremony, during the folding of the flag, during the moment of formal silence. Not what you'd say you did if someone asked you about it afterward, but what you genuinely, actually did in that specific moment. Most of us have never been formally taught what these specific traditions actually require, which means most of us have probably made at least one of these 6 mistakes without ever realizing it at the time, simply because no one had ever walked us through what the moment actually called for beforehand. The first mistake is talking or socializing through the honor guard ceremony. The flag folding, the salute, the sound of taps. These specific moments are formal, choreographed acts of honor, performed with exact precision by trained service members specifically because the moment itself deserves that level of care and attention. But it's genuinely common to see attendees continue quiet conversations, check phones, or simply treat these moments as a lull before the real part of the service resumes. These rituals are the real part. They deserve the same full, silent attention as anything spoken from the podium. Consider what these specific movements actually represent within the whole ceremony. Every fold of the flag, every precise motion the honor guard performs, carries formal meaning developed over generations of military tradition. Not arbitrary ceremony, but a deliberate, practiced language of respect. Talking through it, even quietly, even with good intentions, communicates that this language doesn't require your full attention, when in fact it's often the single most meaningful part of the entire service for the family receiving it. The second mistake is politicizing the service, using the moment as a platform for opinions about war, military policy, or current political debates. A funeral, and especially a military funeral service, was never meant to become a stage for anyone's political views, however strongly held or however personally connected they might feel to the moment at hand. The family gathered specifically to honor a specific life and a specific sacrifice, not to hear anyone's broader personal opinions about foreign policy or military leadership decisions. Whatever your views on these larger questions, this particular room, on this particular day, belongs entirely to grief and honor, not debate. Notice how quickly a well-meaning comment about military policy or a specific conflict can shift a room's entire atmosphere, pulling attention away from the person actually being mourned and toward an argument that has nothing to do with their individual life or sacrifice. The family didn't gather to hear anyone's broader political conclusions. They gathered to grieve one specific person, and that focus deserves to remain entirely undisturbed by outside debates, however important those debates might feel in other contexts. The third mistake is skipping past the actual service and sacrifice entirely, turning the eulogy into something focused only on heaven and salvation. Faith absolutely belongs in this particular moment, and comfort about eternal hope is genuinely appropriate and welcomed within a Christian service. But when the eulogy moves so quickly toward theology that it never actually acknowledges what the person genuinely did, the specific service, the sacrifice, the courage, the years given, something essential and important gets lost entirely. The family needs to hear that their loved one's earthly service and sacrifice actually mattered, not just that their soul's eternal destination is settled. Consider the specific grief a military family carries, distinct from other kinds of loss. They're mourning not just a person, but often years of separation, danger, sacrifice, and a specific kind of courage that shaped their loved one's entire identity. A eulogy that moves straight to theology, without ever naming any of that, can leave a family feeling like the actual life lived, the actual service rendered, was somehow secondary to the sermon being preached over it. The fourth mistake is mishandling the flag or its symbolism. Not standing when appropriate, not removing a hat, not understanding the specific weight this particular symbol carries in this specific setting. The flag draping the casket, later folded into its precise triangular shape and formally presented to the grieving family, represents something specific and deeply sacred within long-standing military tradition, an entire life of service distilled into a single physical object. Treating it casually, remaining seated when everyone else stands, keeping a hat on during the salute, communicates something the person likely doesn't intend, simply through a lack of basic awareness about what the moment actually requires. A few simple guidelines can prevent most of these mistakes entirely. Stand when the flag is being moved or presented, remove any hat during the salute and the playing of taps, and follow the lead of those around you who clearly know the expected protocol if you're genuinely uncertain. None of this requires military experience of your own. It simply requires paying attention and following the room's lead rather than your own comfort or habit. The fifth mistake is redirecting attention toward your own story instead of honoring the person actually being remembered. My uncle did 2 tours. I remember when I served. These comments, however well-intentioned, quietly shift the moment's focus away from the specific person and sacrifice being honored, and toward the speaker's own experience instead. There's a time and place for sharing your own military connections and stories. This particular service, centered on this particular person, usually isn't it. Ask yourself a simple question before sharing a personal military connection at someone else's service. Does this comment actually honor the person being remembered? Or does it redirect the conversation toward my own experience instead? If it's genuinely the former, it may land well. If it's the latter, even unintentionally, it's usually better saved for a private conversation after the service, once the family's attention isn't required to be elsewhere. And the sixth, maybe the easiest to fall into without realizing it, treating the military honors themselves as an interruption to be endured, rather than the central act of respect they actually are. Checking a phone during the 21-gun salute, shifting impatiently during taps, waiting for it to be over. These honors aren't a formality tacked onto the funeral. They are, in many ways, the funeral's actual centerpiece, the nation's own way of saying thank you, performed with exacting precision, specifically because the moment deserves nothing less. Consider how differently these moments land on the family, depending on how the surrounding crowd responds to them. A room fully present, fully still, fully attentive during the salute and taps communicates that the sacrifice being honored actually matters to everyone gathered, not just to the family directly grieving it. A room checking phones or shifting impatiently communicates something very different, however unintentional that message actually is. So what does it actually look like to honor a military funeral? Well, avoiding these 6 mistakes. It looks like full, silent attention during the honor guard ceremony. It looks like leaving political opinions entirely outside the service. It looks like a eulogy that honors both earthly sacrifice and eternal hope, not just one or the other. It looks like standing, removing your hat, and understanding what the flag actually represents. It looks like keeping the focus on the person being honored rather than your own story. And it looks like treating every part of the military honors as the sacred centerpiece they actually are, not an interruption to be waited out. None of these mistakes usually come from malice. Most people who make them simply don't know better, having never been taught what military funeral tradition actually requires or means. Since most of us encounter these specific rituals only rarely, at scattered points across an entire lifetime. But knowing better is available to all of us, and a little preparation before attending one of these services can prevent an honest mistake from adding unintended pain to an already difficult day for the family involved. If you're attending a military funeral soon, take a moment beforehand to learn what to expect, so that your presence there adds genuine comfort rather than an unintentional distraction from the honor the day was actually built around. Here's a simple, practical guide worth knowing before your next military funeral. If you're not already familiar with the specific protocols involved, when the honor guard begins the flag folding ceremony, remain standing and silent, giving them your full attention just as you would during any other formal, sacred moment. When taps begins to play, stand at attention if you're able, remove any hat, and simply let the sound fill the space without checking a phone or shifting restlessly. During the rifle volley, commonly called the 21-gun salute, remain still and silent. The sudden sound can be startling if you're not expecting it. But it's a formal part of the honors, not an interruption to brace against. When the flag is formally presented to the family, this is typically the ceremony's most emotionally weighted moment, and it deserves complete stillness and full attention from everyone present, not just those in the immediate family. If you're asked to speak or share a memory, prepare something that genuinely honors the specific person's service and character, rather than defaulting to generic comfort language or shifting the focus toward your own experiences or opinions. If you're uncertain about any specific protocol in the moment itself, the safest approach is simply to follow the lead of those around you who clearly know what's expected. The funeral home staff, the honor guard themselves, or family members who have attended these services before. None of this requires military background or expertise of your own. It simply requires a genuine willingness to learn what the moment actually calls for, and enough humility to prioritize the family's experience of the day over your own comfort, habits, or unfamiliarity with the specific traditions involved. A funeral of any kind deserves reverence. A military funeral carries an additional layer of formal tradition worth understanding and honoring specifically, precisely because it represents not just personal grief, but a nation's own act of gratitude towards someone who gave real years, real risk, and sometimes their entire life in service to others. If this stirred something in you, brother, sister, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to Biblical Warning now, and let's keep examining these hidden places together, one warning at a time.